for capitalism, us being in infinite browsing mode is amazing. I mean, even if you just use that technical example of Netflix, like if we're just on there browsing and browsing and browsing indefinitely, that's an amazing thing, and never settling, right? And always coming back. Maybe this one's going to be the one. Maybe the next one's going to be the one. And so, do you think that that is the case, that capitalism sort of creates infinite browsing or incentivizes infinite browsing as a way to keep us unsatisfied consumers, always looking for the next product or experience that's going to bring us that meaning that's been like sucked down of society and sucked down of our lives by that capitalist financialized system?
Well, I think it's baked into the logic of the message, because if you need to kind of continue your revenue streams forever, you don't want to, sell someone
You don't
one
want people
thing
who
and
are
them to be
satisfied.
satisfied for 30 years. You want them to constantly be coming back and feeling like they need to upgrade. Apple has perfected it. If you have an iPhone 6 and it's perfectly working, you're made to feel like you should have an iPhone 7, then an 8, then a 9, then a 10. Repeat that across so many firms. And the whole point of, marketing is to induce, it used to be, there are times where it was just informing you of products that were out there, but then it made a switch and got revved up to being inducing feelings. You have a disease, you need a medicine. You are ugly, you need makeup. You're feeling empty, you need this thing. And this leads to a feeling so many people my age feel, which is, we feel sometimes the result of all this is like there's been a flood that has washed away, for good and for ill, so many things that could have rooted us. So for ill, the financialization and the marketization and the destroying of all these precious, public common institutions. For good, the deconstruction of these, institutions and meanings and communities that had too much injustice and hierarchy baked into them, that it's correct that they had to go. There was no way of saving them. But the result of all of it is we feel like we're in a desert. We feel like we exist after a flood. We're grabbing for specific types of meaning to, get a quick hit of meaning. And that's the most dangerous type of meaning making. The healthy type of meaning making is organic, slow, over the long term, reforesting the desert. That's the message I want to give at this book, is that we can pine for the past before the flood, which I think is unjust and wrong. This world of maybe meaningful, for some, involuntary commitments. We can surf the waves of this, of this, lost time, and just try to get as much experience as we can. Or we can start planting. Or we can start saying, the institutions are corrupted, but let's start regrowing some with healthier meanings. The communities were not good for some people, but let's start making some inclusive communities. Patriotism got perverted by warmongering, but let's start falling in love with places again and falling in love with the people in those places and build a healthier form of that. So many of these ideas were that were built or maintained were actually manipulative. We got screwed over by some people, but let's start building some better institutions and stewarding the parts that we love. And what is the single action? It's a reforestation project. And what is the moment where that reforestation project begins? It's in the moment when you set out on a long haul. That's what the planting of the seed is. That's what the planting of the seeds in those reforestation projects is, the commitment. And I'm pulling up a poem that is like the heart of this whole book, which is a Wendell Berry poem, The Farmer Philosopher. He says, "In the dark of the moon, in flying snow, in the dead of winter, war spreading, families dying, the world in danger, I walk the rocky hillside, sowing clover." That's the message of the book. So many people feel like we're on the rocky hillside and we can throw up our hands and say nothing's ever going to change. We can be delusional and say, oh, if we just have the one giant march in the streets, or if this one candidate was elected, it would fix everything, which eventually will curdle into throwing up our hands and being cynical because it won't work. That's one option we can choose with the rocky hillside. Some people can be nostalgic and say, oh, I remember when this hillside wasn't rocky and it used to be covered in clover. That's another option. Or we could say, now's the time to sow. And the act of that sowing is overcoming our fears to dedicate ourselves to causes and places and ideas and institutions and crafts, and most importantly, people over the long haul.
So, I feel like we can't have the conversation about meaning without bringing up the elephant in the room, which dominated, notions of meaning for so long, which is religion. And like, it's interesting because I could see the argument being made from either side of this. The argument that, well, religion doesn't really provide meaning. It's the opiate of the masses, as Friedrich Nietzsche said. Or you could argue, and many people have, that no, it was like the scaffolding that kind of held society together. And, I'm a deeply secular person. The name of my YouTube channel is Secular Talk. So clearly I'm a non-believer. But is there a point there that like religion filled the role for meaning for a long time and it was sort of a glue that held society together, and now with religion no longer being anywhere near as prominent in modern society, people are looking everywhere for meaning and coming up short? Not to say that religion was a sufficient answer, because it wasn't, but are people looking in all the wrong places now for meaning, and that's where we get the infinite options and, people can't stop filling their time with bullshit?
One thing that's not talked about a lot, so religious communities were, it's above my pay grade and above the book's mission to kind of allocate, should we be religious or not. It has some religious, I interviewed long haul heroes that were atheists but were totally and completely alive with meaning, and I also interviewed other religious people, and interviewed a priest and a nun on their journey through their religious commitment. So it's all in there. One thing I like pointing out is we hear about the decline of religion and the increase of secularization, and that's part of the story of declining and like the daily experience of meaning. But as has been shown by, Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, or Diminished Democracy by Theda Skocpol, and a bunch of other folks who have written about this, all types of communities of meaning have been in decline over the last decades. The amount of people, part of this book's kind of like this hunky-dory mid-century spirit of, you might get your most extreme version of your most pungent version of existential meaning at a religious community, but you get kind of a microdose of that at a normal civic group, like a normal bike activist group when they feel like they're fighting for a bike lane because their friend who died. There's a little bit of that, there's a dose of meaning in that. There's a dose of meaning in the PTA. There's a dose of meaning when Gabriela Grajeda in my book continues the Bolivian dance troupe to another generation. There's a dose of meaning when Mickey Raphael, who I interviewed for this book, plays harmonica for Willie Nelson and is stewarding, the craft of harmonica into the new century. There's a dose of meaning when Irene Lee starts a locally sourced restaurant in Boston called May May. There's a dose of meaning when Evan Wolfson did his 32-year walk to fight for marriage equality. All of these are meaning-making projects, and part of what I feel like was my journey of discovery on this book is the discovery that there is a meaning-making aspect to all acts of commitment. I talk about the word dedication as having two meanings. One meaning is to work at something for a long time. She was dedicated to the project. That's something you would say. But it also means to make something holy. They dedicated a memorial. They dedicated a church. They dedicated a synagogue. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think there is something, if you want to use religious terms, call it holy. If you want to use secular terms, just call it meaning and purpose, to that feels deeper, that feels more than the humdrum of ordinary life when you're making a commitment. And there's been a decline, not just in religious groups, but also in this, secular civic meaning-making groups. And as many kind of old heads on the left will talk about, the meaning they felt in the 60s has been in decline, the types of cause work, it's not like the old days where everyone threw themselves into it, it's very different, and so I think there's been a lot to this beyond just secularism.